So The Last of Us is a thing. You must have at least heard of this one. It was a pretty big deal when it was coming out for a couple of reasons. I think first and foremost, people were interested to see if a show based on a video game could work, and they were right to be worried. The track record for adaptations of games hasn't exactly been stellar. But the show was being put on by HBO and was co-created with the dude behind Chernobyl, so hopes were high. Many people wanted the show to be excellent because the story and characters of the game were so beloved. Actually, I'm one of those people. My first introduction to The Last of Us was the game, which I played just after it came out, and not one of the numerous ports or remasters it's had since. Seriously, this game could give Skyrim a run for its money. The game offered up a very interesting character drama during a zombie apocalypse. Not an especially novel idea, but the way the zombies functioned made them uniquely terrifying and somehow more revolting than just dead people. But it wasn't the mushroom zombies that set the game apart. Instead, it was the strong interpersonal story between the two central characters. It was in these main characters that I, and many others, found the game remarkable. Sure, the gameplay was fun, but it wasn't what drove me to keep playing. And so when the show was announced 10 years later, I think people felt very protective over these characters, especially if the backlash to the sequel was any indication. But these fears turned out to be unfounded, as the show was a fantastic adaptation, and it is, in my opinion, superior to the game. I watched The Last of Us once the whole show was released. What can I say? I hate waiting a week between episodes. The show explores the characters' interactions a little differently, while sticking to the main plot points strongly. There are, of course, a few changes, but I found them welcome. The biggest difference I felt was how much more I was affected by the events on screen being depicted in the show rather than the game. I think the show felt more horrifying and heartbreaking. But I don't want to sit here and talk about the differences and merits of the show versus the game, and how ludonarrative plays into our connection to characters versus the parasocial interaction of television and movies. Goodness knows there are already a lot of videos on why the story works better in show form, and while I agree, I also don't really care. Video games and traditional visual mediums are different and both have their merits. What interested me more was the fact that the story of The Last of Us is 10 years old and yet still feels relevant, possibly more so. That might have something to do with the global health crisis we just lived through, but the story's longevity caught my attention. Zombies have been popular for a while now, and while super interesting, they aren't the real focus of The Last of Us. They act as more of a backdrop to the post-apocalypse going on. And post-apocalyptic fiction has been exceedingly popular lately, but also has a literary history that goes a lot further back than you might think. So while it was an outstanding narrative, The Last of Us is only the most recent in a long lineage of post-apocalyptic media, which begs the question, why do we love a good post-apocalypse? And why are they more popular than ever? I think this has to do with the disillusionment of our current system, the day-to-day purpose of our lives, and the dangers of escapism. And while my arguments are by no means comprehensive, I think they are incredibly insightful and should elucidate some of the reasons for our collective love of post-apocalyptic fiction. And so today, I want to talk about The Last of Us. In case you really didn't know, and based on my intro I would find that really hard to believe, The Last of Us is based on a video game, specifically the first of two games. Retroactively named The Last of Us Part 1, the first game was released in 2013 and was critically acclaimed. The game won award after award and garnered near perfect review scores. Most commonly praised was the story and the portrayal of the two protagonists. Following this success, Naughty Dog began work on a sequel. Neil Druckmann was placed in charge as writer and director to the follow-up, and The Last of Us Part 2 was released in 2020. While technically and narratively astounding, the game was also divisive. Although the main cast were once again praised for their craft and the story was critically acclaimed, many fans felt the direction was a departure from the focus and values that had made the first game so great. Apparently, during the time leading up to the sequel's release, Naughty Dog had already attempted to have a film adaptation of the story created. Druckmann wrote a script for a live-action movie, and supposedly Sam Raimi was attached, but nothing came of that, and so Druckmann pivoted to an animated short movie, but this was canned by Sony. Because of course it was. Fuck Sony. But this turned out not to matter because in 2020, HBO announced that they had come to an agreement to adapt The Last of Us into a miniseries, which thrilled fans. Put some of that Game of Thrones level money behind the project. It was also announced that Druckmann would work with Chernobyl creator Craig Mazin to help fill the gaps in Druckmann's lack of TV script experience. Due to the nature of the story, casting the main characters needed to be handled correctly. The Mandalorian's Pedro Pascal was joined by British actress Bella Ramsey, who was known for playing the titular Hilda, which if you're a longtime subscriber you'll know is one of my all-time favorite shows. The Last of Us was released weekly in early 2023 and has been called a huge success and might possibly be the greatest video game adaptation to date. The show's success was so huge that Naughty Dog and Druckmann have stated that they have no plans to pursue The Last of Us in video game form anymore, as the show seems to be a better avenue to tell that story. As of right now, while writing this script, it is too soon to tell how many awards the show will win, but I think it's safe to say that it's at least a handful. And that will probably include at least one best screenplay because the story is fantastic. If you're not familiar with the story and would prefer to watch it rather than have my irritating voice drill the narrative through your ears, this is your spoiler warning. The Last of Us opens up with an interview from the 60s, which is used to introduce the viewer to cordyceps. Cordyceps are a genus of parasitic fungi that have evolved alongside many species of arthropods. The fungi spores infect the host and then slowly grow, taking over the body and controlling the central nervous system. The cordyceps then physically causes the host to move to a location that is advantageous before sprouting out of the body in order to spread its spores and repeat the cycle. In the interview, a scientist walks us through what cordyceps are and how we would have no way of stopping them if the cordyceps were to make a jump from arthropods to Homo sapiens.
So if that happens,
we lose.
In 2003, Sarah Miller wants to get something for her father Joel, who is working a long shift on his birthday in order to make ends meet. While at school, Sarah keeps hearing of strange events in other parts of the world, and some of the people around her act a bit strangely. But all of this happens in the background as Sarah continues her day through school, and then eventually going into the city to fix her father's watch before returning home and looking after her elderly neighbor, who exhibits some alarming behavior. Yikes. Later that night, all hell breaks loose and Sarah watches as her neighbor attacks people, and she's not the only one who's going crazy. Joel saves Sarah, and together with Joel's brother Tommy, they attempt to escape as the world slowly devolves into chaos. Joel and Sarah find the army, but are held at gunpoint.
We're not sick.
Eventually, they are shot at. Joel is grazed by a bullet and is saved by Tommy, but Sarah took a direct shot and dies in Joel's arms. 20 years later, the United States is a very different place. The country is mostly vast expanses of wilderness filled with infected people that divide city-states or quarantine zones controlled by Fedra. Once an arm of the government, Fedra is now a militant organization that has very sparse connections from city to city. Joel is now living in Boston and makes a living working and smuggling goods both in and out of the QZ. After being screwed over on a trade deal for a car battery in order to leave and find his brother, Joel and his partner Tess stumble across the Fireflies, an organization that is working towards fighting the tyranny of Fedra. Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, pleads with Joel and Tess to use their skills and take a girl named Ellie to a facility across the country. After escaping the QZ, the trio find themselves in an infested city crawling with now infected people known as clickers. Tess is bitten and pleads with Joel to save Ellie because it turns out that Ellie is immune.
I never ask you for anything, not to feel the way I felt, not to you shut the fuck up because I don't have time.
Tess then sacrifices herself in order to make sure Joel and Ellie can get away. The pair then spend the next 6 months crossing the country, first stopping at a compound owned by a friend of Joel's before passing through Kansas City and getting caught up with the local government. They then make their way to a town in Wyoming where Joel reunites with Tommy. Joel begrudgingly agrees to take Ellie the rest of the way, even though he feels like he's getting older and is going to let her down. This sort of happens when he is injured in a run-in with a starving religious community. Ellie must then use what she has learned to save herself and Joel. And finally, the pair make it all the way to Seattle and meet with the Fireflies. Ellie is taken and prepped for surgery, but Joel is told that because the cordyceps infect the central nervous system, she will probably not survive the surgery. Not willing to lose Ellie the way he lost Sarah, Joel makes the decision to save her and kills a bunch of people to get her out of there, and then lies to her.
Swear to me that everything you said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
And now you know some shit's gonna go down in the second season. For the sake of clarity, I want to touch on the fact that The Last of Us is a zombie post-apocalypse, and that comes with its own sets of tropes and analysis. Even the word zombie has its roots in Haitian culture and belief, and there are issues around racism and colonialism, and a whole mess of other discursive criticism, like the way zombies have been used as a reflection of the fears of society throughout time. This is all super interesting and important, and if you want to hear more, I highly recommend the 3-part series on the history of zombies in fiction and in legend by Dr. Emily Zarka on the Storied YouTube channel. And not just because Dr. Zarka is my academic crush. In The Last of Us, the zombies, or clickers/cordyceps, are not the focus of the story in the same way they are in other zombie literature. In fact, The Last of Us only gives us the first day or so of the initial infection before skipping ahead by 2 decades. So it's less of the 28 days later and more of the 20 years later. So while I acknowledge that this is a zombie apocalypse, the show doesn't focus on this as much as use the cordyceps as a means of setting up an apocalyptic scenario. And I want to be like the show and focus on the post-apocalypse part, and maybe I'll come back to zombie narratives another time. The concept of the apocalypse has been around for a significant amount of time, especially in religious contexts. Historically, the word was used in conjunction with Revelation and the biblical book of the same name. Apocalypse comes from the Greek word for revelation and used to mean the same thing. Over time, the meaning and usage has changed to reflect the end of the world and the narratives depicted in the book of Revelations. There is still some vestigial evidence of this previous understanding in some apocalyptic fiction, such as the main character having or understanding some kind of truth beyond the mundane, but for the most part, apocalypse is understood to be the end of the world. A post-apocalypse is therefore after the apocalypse, which sort of implies the world didn't completely end and therefore was not in fact the apocalypse and more of a massive catastrophe, but we're not splitting hairs here. Apocalyptic fiction of any kind was mostly relegated to ecclesiastical writings until the 1800s, when everyone's favorite genre-defining author decided to switch things up. After writing Frankenstein years earlier and creating what would eventually become horror science fiction and the origins of modern fantasy, Mary Shelley decided she was going to write another genre-defying book. She probably did not actually think this and just wrote a story, although apparently it was her favorite. The Last Man was published in 1826 and is widely considered the first work of post-apocalyptic fiction. It follows a man during the rise of a plague and how it affects Europe and eventually the world and leads to the end of humanity. Poignant work for today's world. But back then, the public fucking hated it. They claimed it was too bleak, unrealistic, and not well written, and for a long time it was considered Shelley's worst work. You know, she wrote a lot more than just Frankenstein. In the 1960s, The Last Man was reevaluated by modern audiences and scholars, and drew much more praise. By this time, the post-apocalypse narrative had been bandied about in literature and even a bit on the moving screen, so Shelley's narrative was much more well received. Since that time, the post-apocalypse has been a constant reoccurring trope in media, from the aforementioned zombie apocalypse to the recent rise of the adjacent genre of young adult dystopian fiction, to the way that news shows are always talking about how bad things are. You know,
tonight's news, death, doom, despair.
Sports. So why did we collectively hate post-apocalyptic fiction before, and why do we love it so much now? I don't think it would be much of a stretch to say that the world has become a bleak place to live in. I'm not totally convinced that the world is actually worse than it was in the 1820s, but I think the individual and collective outlook on the world has become more bleak. With good reason though. Environmental crisis and collapse have become real possibilities, nuclear warfare has loomed heavily over us since the 1960s, pandemics, garbage, and let's not forget everyone's favorite system of control and slavery, capitalism. Our understanding of the world has changed, and our outlook on how we function within it has evolved a lot since the time of The Last Man's publication. The 1800s were a time of massive discovery and globalization. The huge discoveries and inventions of that time would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. History paints this as an exciting time to be alive because the people believed that they were working towards progress and understanding the truth of the world around them through positivism. But as we moved beyond the Industrial Revolution and the computational one, we have slowly come to realize that most people do not actually benefit from this progress. And the thing that this progress leads to is not a place of bounty for all, but a place of excess for some and the promise of labor for others. In terms of the meaning of our lives, we have become disillusioned. We are no longer condemned to freedom, as Sartre would say, but condemned to the labor of our unfreedom. Unfreedom is a philosophical term that's been around for a while, but today we're interested in the way Herbert Marcuse understood it. He argues that our understanding of freedom is actually skewed because of the social, economic, and political systems we live in. There doesn't need to be a formal conspiracy to keep us down, but that capitalism has created a kind of commodified freedom that we collectively buy into that keeps us chained to it because we believe in the freedom it supposedly provides us. If you want to hear more about Marcuse, check out the video I did on WALL-E. Modern philosopher, and raccoon turned into a human, Slavoj Žižek elaborates more by saying that this idea that working hard brings prosperity and wealth is a lie, and that if we commodify ourselves on the free market to accomplish a job, we are selling ourselves into our own unfreedom. And if we believe that this gives us the freedom to live our lives the way we want, we are in fact complicit in our own unfreedom without even realizing it. With this in mind, post-apocalyptic fiction offers us the opportunity to engage in a kind of escapism. Because so many of us feel disillusioned in our lives and are powerless to change it or our circumstances, we often think of the idea of, what if we just burned it all to the ground? The post-apocalypse offers us the opportunity to do that. But safely, from the comfort of your own home. But this would of course require a massive event in order to totally escape the clutches of capitalism. And I mean massive. The actual global pandemic we just had only furthered capitalism's chokehold on us. Thus, we would need not just an upheaval or catastrophe, but a total apocalypse in which only those who are the most resilient would survive. And even then, it would probably just be random. Despite the massive personal loss, emotional and physical hardships, and traumatic experiences, we find stories of human perseverance inspiring in post-apocalyptic fiction. And from these stories of hardship, we also see people rebuild. In the beginning of The Last of Us, pre-apocalypse, we can see that Joel is strapped for cash. He works hard for his daughter in order to make ends meet.
I'm not splitting this job. I barely want to split it with you. You could work a double.
Literally?
Despite being told that he is free, Joel is subjected to his own unfreedom in order to survive in the current regime.
Some people wanted to own everything. And some people didn't want anyone to own anything at all.
Which one were you?
Neither, I just did my job.
But in the post-apocalypse, Joel inadvertently becomes more. He works not just for his own freedom, but to actively break out of Fedra's boot heel and find his brother. He is an actual agent in his own true freedom, and he affects his community.
Robert is terrified of you. So you march out of here all Clint Eastwood, he's gonna get wind of it and skip.
In the wilderness, we see Joel is more than capable of keeping himself and Ellie alive. On a broader scale, we also see that a lot of other characters talk about rebellion. The Fireflies are a resistance group, although ultimately another kind of power structure, they do push for revolution. After the horrors and hardships, we often see post-apocalyptic stories turn into the pastoral. An entire episode of the show focuses on how the doomsday prepper Bill escapes the army and creates an idyllic, albeit deadly, place to live for himself and eventually his partner Frank. And later on, we see a literal communist town in Jackson, Wyoming.
Nah, it ain't like that.
It is that, literally. This is the commune. We're communists.
The show often depicts how people have thrived in the post-apocalypse. They show the classic human determination and survival to spring from the ashes and create a world that is better than what was left behind. In order to do so, characters go through intense pain of all kinds, but this is to be expected from an apocalypse. But after, we see new forms of government and new ways of survival. Of course, there is always a darker side of the apocalypse. There will always be those who are not strong enough to survive, or those who cannot seem to find meaning in a world where there seems to be none. Before a post-apocalypse, usually we assume or are met with a world that is supposed to be our current world, if not similar to it. In this relatively peaceful, if bleak-looking era, we often have the opportunity to ask questions like, what does it mean to exist, and what is my purpose? On a broad level, this can have sweeping and meaningful repercussions on a person's life, and I've touched on this in a few episodes, like Groundhog Day, Rick and Morty, and Soul, so go check those out. But from a less abstract viewpoint, this largely affects where we derive meaning in our day-to-day actions as well. Some people find meaning in religion, of course, but as the popularity of religion wanes, people look to other places. Some scholars argue that the place where modern Westerners have turned to is consumerism, and I would argue that this makes a lot of sense as a symptom of our unfreedom. In the pre-apocalypse, it is through our purchasing of things that we derive meaning. The drive to have money so you can spend it and consume has become the way we justify continuing to labor or to live. We can see that Sarah wants to fix Joel's watch for him and then watch a movie, and both of these things are about their relationship and spending time together, but both of these things are undercut by the commodification of the products central to the interaction. These meaningful interactions the two characters are supposed to have are hinged on commodities and consumption. And this is necessary because capitalism wants consumers to buy into the idea that products lead to meaningful connections, because then it feels like more than just mindless consumerism. It feels like you're doing something meaningful for someone who matters. However, there's no real distinction between the two. You're still buying something. It just makes us feel better about purchasing if we feel like there's something more. But in the post-apocalypse, consumerism has been done away with for the most part. Hopefully, people are once again truly free and not suffering from the disillusion of working in a world where they feel they cannot change anything. Throughout the show, we see that people are forced to find new meaning of their lives, and they're generally not always as free as we'd like to think they would be. And while this turns out great for some people, that isn't always the case. While trying to get to Seattle, Ellie and Joel come across different people, and more than a few of them cling to destructive purposes or cannot let go of the past. Once immediate survival is no longer the most imminent threat, people are forced to search for reasons to continue living. This is that condemned to freedom bit. Bill finds Frank and that satisfies him, but not everyone is so lucky. As an organization, Fedra itself continues to function as capitalistic in the QZ, which effectively creates haves and have-nots within the boundaries.
You get your own room, you get a nice bed, we eat well, we don't go on patrol, we're cool in the summer, we're warm in the winter.
Many scholars argue that if people or organizations born or created under capitalism survived the apocalypse, then they would be inclined or possibly forced to recreate capitalism because of their understanding or internalization of their own unfreedom. That means that people would not be free under capitalism, and we see that Fedra is ultimately a very authoritarian and possibly totalitarian regime. But there are other organizations that people cling to because institutions often offer peace of mind to people. Riley, for instance, seems to derive hope and therefore meaning from the Fireflies. On an individual level, we also see people try to find purpose. In Kansas City, Ellie and Joel meet Sam and Henry, two brothers running from a prevailing regime in the city, which is run by a woman named Kathleen. All three have their purposes connected. Sam wants to stay with his brother and be brave like his alter ego Super Sam. Henry lives only to keep Sam alive. Sam has become his purpose, and when Sam dies, Henry shoots himself because he feels like he's been left without a purpose, which mirrors Joel's eventual feelings towards Ellie. But Kathleen is far more interesting because of the way she clings to vengeance. Now that the city has been freed from Fedra, the people of Kansas could focus on ensuring the safety of their city from the threat of other people, or the clickers roaming out of the city, or put resources towards food. Instead, however, Kathleen directs all of her people's resources towards revenge on those who sympathized or helped Fedra in any way, and her personal vendetta against Henry, who is partially responsible for her brother's death. And because this is seemingly the only purpose she has and clings to, she drives most, if not all, of the survivors in Kansas City to death instead of dealing with the actual problems. A foreshadowing of what will come in season 2, I think. Later in season 1, Ellie and Joel meet a man named David, who claims to serve God. But instead of using religion as a place to find strength, David derives purpose from the position of power his faith has provided him with. He is also dead set on being the one to provide for his community, and he is willing to forego the basic tenets of his own religion in order to be viewed as a savior by his town. Thus, David endorses murder, cannibalism, and it's heavily implied that he's done some other things that will get me demonetized for saying. Most central to the plot is Joel. When we are introduced to Joel in the Post-apocalypse, we find someone who is mostly surviving. His relationship with Tess and his need to leave in order to find Tommy suggests that Joel derives meaning from his family, or those he chooses to be his family. Not that much different from where he was before the clickers, but we also see that Joel is a little hollow. And it's not hard to see why after watching him lose his daughter to what could be seen as a symbol of the old regime in a faceless soldier rather than the chaos of the cordyceps. We also find out that Joel attempted suicide, implying there was a time when he felt there was no reason to live. However, he was unsuccessful.
It was me. I was the guy who shot and missed.
Of course, the central purpose of the first season is to show Joel and Ellie becoming closer and how they begin to see each other as a surrogate family. This is why Ellie is unwilling to leave Joel behind when he is injured. Eventually, Joel begins to see Ellie as his daughter, his new purpose. That means he is unwilling to give her up, even if it means the possibility of an end to the cordyceps, or, if he has to murder a bunch of relatively innocent people. Purpose is what drives a lot of the conflict in the show. When characters have goals or find meaning from fundamentally diverging axioms, we wind up with nasty conflicts. The show kind of tricks the viewer into seeing Joel's purpose become Ellie's well-being, as though he's healing from the tragedy of losing Sarah, only to flip that on its head when he takes his purpose too far. And there are some great discussions to be had about Joel's interactions as being justified in order to save one person, because no life is worth another, but that has to be weighed against the actions of what he had to do to save her, and whether or not that was morally justified. But this episode isn't about deontology, it's about the post-apocalypse. And post-apocalyptic fiction is often interested in providing a space to explore how people deal with their own freedom and come to grips with their own shortcomings, overthrowing power structures of old and finding a way to truly be human. And while we all like to think we would be the ones to feel like we could survive and begin to build a better world, that's probably not the case. But that's why it's super okay to have an escapist adventure into the post-apocalypse. Or is it? As far as I can tell, post-apocalyptic fiction feeds into the idea that things are bleak, but they could be worse, or that if things did get worse, we could survive. In watching or reading the story, you can imagine yourself as a character that rises above the hardships, someone who affects real change in your own life, and if you're not like the characters in The Last of Us, maybe even find a purpose that doesn't drive you to murder people, if it's not too much to ask. That isn't to say that people who are on the brink of survival won't do desperate things, but when you're just reading and participating in fiction, it's perfectly harmless, right? You spend a few hours reading or viewing or playing a story in which you have the chance to watch characters overcome adversity and rise above the difficulties of their situation. You watch them enact great feats of humanity in the face of existential ambivalence, and you feel good about your own life again because you see how it feels to enact change. The problem is that this kind of escapism isn't as harmless as we would like to believe, and actually plays into our own unfreedom. Zizek argues that capitalism as a system undermines its own downfall by commodifying that unrest into a capitalistic component. Because post-apocalyptic fiction is a form of media, it can and has been commodified. That means that the want to tear down the system of power is a feeling that can be satiated by a commercial good. Any post-apocalyptic narrative can be created and then sold to you as a means of playing into your unfreedom. You get the chance to feel like you undermined the system by reading about ways you could have been like Bill and ready yourself for the post-apocalypse, or like Joel and learn to survive. When in actuality, all of the things that you bought in order to prep for the apocalypse, or teach yourself survival skills, or even learn how to survive an apocalypse, still play into the consumption of goods. Anything you buy that was created in a capitalistic environment only benefits that system. So while we love a post-apocalypse because it lets us see a world in which we could affect real change and create a better world where we matter and rise above adversity instead of being stuck in the drudgery of labor, what we're actually doing is perpetuating our unfreedom by choosing to buy a product commodified by the very system we want to overthrow and is being sold to us because we feel unempowered. And it gets worse, because when people feel like they've engaged in an act of anti-capitalism, they feel like they beat the system. They become less likely to engage in actual anti-capitalist behaviors. So in reality, the reason we love post-apocalyptic fiction is because it can be used as a commodified form of media to keep you satisfied in your own unfreedom while inadvertently bolstering the system you sought to undermine, even if only in your imagination. I mean, that's a fucking cynical take if I've ever heard one, but the scholarship backs it up, and you can find it all down below if you want. Our need to consume makes us feel empty, so the creation of post-apocalyptic literature in any form is used as a way for us to feel fulfilled in our consumption, which gives us the feeling that we did more than just consume. So in reality, perhaps the reason we love post-apocalyptic fiction now is because we're already living in a kind of capitalist post-apocalypse, and our unconscious minds are trying to tell us to seek true freedom, but we can't see what that is because of our own unfreedom. But let's get back to the original point. The Last of Us is only the most recent in a long line of post-apocalyptic fiction. Zombies have been the most popular of late, but we've also seen pandemics and environmental cataclysms, and there will certainly be more to come in the form of new fads and ways to envision the end times. But the reason people like post-apocalypse now more than ever is because we see the futility of our individual actions in the face of larger institutions and power structures. We feel our lack of agency in the world around us. We feel alienated from ourselves and our own destinies. A post-apocalypse is a way to engage in a world where those systems do not exist, and the human spirit can rise like a phoenix and continue to survive and possibly thrive if the person is strong enough to do so, and we all like to think that could be us. The horrors of the apocalypse are an exploration of what people can do when pushed to their limits, and it's not always about what is good or righteous, but more about what does it mean to survive, and what is there to cling to or derive meaning from if there's no meaning in religion or consumerism. But ultimately, I think that this is a way that the systems we're trying to escape use our dissatisfaction and delusions against us. And I don't have an answer to this particular problem. I love a great story as much as the next person, and The Last of Us is a particularly great example of the genre, and I'm excited to watch more, which I suppose makes me complicit in my own unfreedom. Perhaps the important thing to remember is that in any apocalypse, even a capitalistic apocalypse of our own making, it is our unyielding human spirit that will get us through this, just like it did Joel and Ellie. And that is why The Last of Us is a great example for why we love post-apocalyptic fiction. Here are my stray thoughts. I think the change from spores to mycelium for the show was a good call, infinitely more gross and definitely a neat visual. There is something very viscerally disgusting about fungi infecting people. I'm excited for season 2, and I think some of the shots in the last episode set up that story. I don't think they're going to, but I really hope they change some of the narrative for the second season so it doesn't follow the gain. Spoilers, but I don't see the franchise working as strongly without Joel in the picture. If The Mandalorian has taught us anything, it's that people want to see Pedro Pascal wandering around a vaguely western landscape with his surrogate child. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to double tap that like button and share it around. It was fun to come back to capitalism because nobody seemed to watch that stint that I did on childhood, but if you're looking for some lighter fare, go check those out. And there's lots more cool stuff right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.